I think we're ready to get started.
I've had several requests for some information that's in this presentation, so I think I'm going to do lazy beekeeping here.
Yeah, back to you. That's always good.
Before Michael starts, I'll ask one more time. Is there a Sandra Haynes here or Hans? Okay, I guess not
A
really.
little off there, but I've come to the conclusion anytime somebody says something to me, it kind of makes me angry. It's probably because I'm wrong. I need to think it over. Because I'm probably missing something somewhere. I was watching a movie called Roadie. It had Meatloaf and Art Carney and Jackie Hunter in it, in case any of you remember it. But Art Carney ran this fix-it shop, and the sign over the fix-it shop was, "Everything works if you let it." And as somebody who worked very hard at making things work at the time, I found that very offensive. But eventually, as I got older, I began to realize that there's an awful lot of truth to that. If you figure out how things work and work with it, it's a whole lot less work than when you're working against it. And that's especially true of biological systems like bee colonies. Anyway, they actually had a song in there by Rick Nielsen, who wrote the song, "Everything Works If You Let It." But I used to keep about 4 hives, and every weekend I worked my butt off trying to take care of these 4 hives. And now I have about 200 hives, and I don't work very much at all. So let's talk about some of the things I've changed. Some of the things I probably should be doing and just don't get around to them. But here's a top inference. We talked briefly about top inferences, and that's one of the things people were asking about. This is all the bees going in the top inference here. So why would you want to do top inferences? Well, there's the grass in front of the hive issue that it blocks the bottom inference and they can't get in and out. And of course there's, where I am, there's the snow issue. If it snows, some winters we get a lot of snow, some winters we don't get any snow, but if it snows, it's real likely in 2 days I'll get a nice sunny day warm enough for them to get a cleansing flight, and now the inferences are all blocked with snow, and so I got to go shovel the snow out of the way to open up the inferences, so if there's a warm day they can get a cleansing flight if I've got bottom inferences. If I got top inferences, it's not an issue because they're almost always sticking up out of the snow no matter how much the snow drifts or no matter how deep it is. I don't have to worry about mouse guards anymore because I've never had the mice climb in the top yet. Now, in theory, they ought to be able to get up there, but there's bees between them and the bottom where they really want to make their nest, and they don't ever seem to do it. So it's never been an issue. The main reason I did it in the first place was the skunks. I don't know how many of you ever had skunk issues, but basically, you go out to your hives and they're not doing real well, and you start looking around and you see little soggy piles of bees everywhere, you probably have a skunk problem. What the skunks do is they get up in the front of the hive, they get their head down because they're too sensitive here to get stung, but their head's pretty tough. So they get their head down and they scratch on the hive and they get one guard bee to come out and they catch it between their paws, which are pretty covered, they're covered with kind of leathery stuff. And then they roll that bee in the grass and get it to sting the grass. And then they pop it in their mouth, and then they catch another one, and they roll it in the grass, and they pop it in their mouth, and they keep doing that until they have a mouthful of bees, and they suck all the juice out of the bees, and then they spit them out. And then they start doing it again. And the reason you find these little soggy piles of bees is those are the bees they suck all the juice out of. And then they can really just, they'll come and eat handfuls and handfuls of bees out of every hive every night. And you'd think that would be one skunk, but I sat out there all night and shot one skunk thinking I solved the problem, and I still had skunk issues. I still had soggy piles of bees. So I stayed up all night another night and shot another skunk, and I still had a little soggy pile of bees. So I set a live trap out there to see what I'd catch, and I caught another skunk, and you had to figure out how to get rid of a skunk once you have a live trap. That's another story for another time. But eventually I figured out I really just need to rig this up so that the skunks aren't doing this anymore. Because the skunk has a whole family, and the whole family's going to keep coming back here. So if I want to sleep at night, I probably should solve it some other way. So what I did was I went to top inferences, and my skunk problems went away. I probably caused my skunk problems by moving my hives down lower. But see, this is the unintended consequences of life. You start out with, I've got my hives up on these big tall blocks, and I have two issues. One of them is I had a bumper crop that year, and so I was putting supers on with a step ladder. And for those of you who've never done that before, trust me, putting them on with the step ladder is the easy part. Getting them off is the hard part. But because now they're heavy, and you can't put them in front of you because there's a step ladder in the way. So if you turn around and you put them this way, then you fall over frontwards and land on the ground. So you really, your only choice is to hold over your head like this while you climb down, and all the honey is dripping on your head. But, so that was one of my problems. The other problem was I had a windstorm that came through that just plain blew all my hives over simultaneously. Just boom, blew them all over. Well, I thought, I got to do something about that. So I wanted to move them down lower to the ground. So I built these little stands that were only 3.5 inches tall. And that solved those two problems and created my skunk problem. So, so then I went to top entrances and that solved my skunk problem. So I kind of went through a sequence of events to get there. But anyway, it solved my skunk problem. I think you get better ventilation on a couple of reasons. One of them is that hot air rises, and the other one is that moist air rises. In both cases, moist air and hot air are usually what I'm trying to get rid of, or the bees are trying to get rid of. They're trying to dry nectar to make honey. They need the moist air to get out of the hive. And if there's a top entrance, that's the natural direction that air goes. So, yes?
Do you have any opening at all at the bottom so it can actually flow?
Not on purpose, but I probably do, yeah. I probably do because my screen bottom boards, even if I put a tray in it, they kind of leak around the edges. They aren't tight. They're just a piece of plastic that kind of fills the gap. And on my solid bottom boards, I converted them to feeders, and I used to put a board on there, but it seems like the raccoons are always knocking them off, and so I just kind of gave up on them. So there's probably a little screened area that would still let some air in. I think they'd probably do just as well or better if I did close them up entirely on the bottom, but I haven't got it done. They're cheap and easy to make. I'm not running an inner cover. Another advantage to not running an inner cover and an outer cover is you don't have so many pieces of equipment to deal with. You open a hive, you just pop the top off instead of I got to take the top off and then I got to take the other top off and then I got to start working the hive. But they're cheap and easy to make. I think they're safer in the winter because I never get an entrance that's all clogged with dead bees, which I've had happen, and obviously some of you have had happen as well. And that can kill a hive. If they get stuck where they can't get out, they can be in trouble. I could put the hive lower without dealing with the skunks, so the lower hive and this kind of went together. I think you get less condensation for a number of reasons. One of them is I let that moisture out, but another reason is since it's tilted just a little bit, if it does condense on it, it tends to run to the back and drip down the back instead of dripping on the bees. And I think that's an important thing to keep them from getting wet. But keep in mind, back to unintended consequences, you got to look at the whole system when you're going to change something. If you change the top entrance and you're using an excluder, you've just now trapped all the drones below the excluder unless you give them some way out. So if you're going to go to a top entrance only, you really can't do that with an excluder. You're going to have at least a 3/8 inch hole somewhere below that excluder to let those drones out. If you're going to run an excluder. I don't run an excluder, so it's not an issue for me. I just want to make sure you know that, and this is another problem when you pick and choose what you want to do that this person's doing and that person's doing and that person's doing. You may not take into account that this is a whole system. They do this system, and this system works very well for them. And now you took this one thing out of that system and you did it in this system. The results may differ. They may be worse, they may be better, they may be totally different. You have to take into account things like that. Yeah, you can move to a top entrance, but if you're doing your system different than my system, there may be some other unintended side effects like drones stuck. This is the bottom of the cover. This is a shingle shim. I assume you have lots of cedar around here, so there ought to be shingle shims at the local lumber yards, I think. I think this is where most of the cedar shingles come from in the world, right? Basically, these are made out of sawn shingles, and they just cut them up into 1.5 inch strips, and they sell them in the lumber yard to put in windows and doors. They drive them in from both directions to adjust how tight it is so they can nail it into the frame. But that's what these are. You can buy them in a bundle. They're pretty cheap, and I glued it down and stapled it. These are the staples, in case you can't see them, but I glued it and stapled it to this piece of plywood. So the plywood's just cut the size of the box, and then that's just stapled on each side to raise it up to make the opening. And that's basically the whole thing. Now, I do reduce some of them. That's the other question that always comes up. I usually buy some screen molding because it's simple and I don't have to make it, but I would probably, if I had more time and I wasn't working all the time, I'd probably just run a piece of wood through the table saw and cut me a little piece. But basically a screen molding is 1/4 inch tall by 3/4 inch wide by whatever. It's a little bit rounded. But I cut it to be about 2 inches short of the whole entrance and put one nail in the middle into the top. And then if I want to open it, I can pivot it open, and when I want to close it, I can pivot it closed. It sounds easier than it is in real life because I tend to propolize it, and I might have to pry it a little loose before I open it, but basically that's what it does. But honestly, the more I've used those, I usually just leave them closed. I actually find they seem to do really well with that little 2-inch opening, and I usually just leave it that way. Here it is on the hive. Right here's the gap where the bees are going to come and go. This is 3/4 inch plywood. I probably prefer 3/4 inch plywood because it doesn't warp as much, and it's nice and heavy and doesn't blow off very easily, but there's this other issue that the scientists don't even seem to be looking at, that gravity keeps increasing every year. And that 3/4 inch plywood weighs a lot more now than it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And it kind of hurts trying to manhandle a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood and cut it up by myself, and I don't generally have any help. So I've kind of gone to 1/2 inch plywood, even though I don't like it quite as much, but I can manage it easier. So, and it works fine. But 3/4 is nice because it warps less. You get rain on it all the time and whatever, it does sometimes warp. And then I just put enough bricks on it to hold the corners down and call it good. Once I glue it down, it stays, right? Another thing I went to was uniform frame size. When I started out, I bought a typical kit. It was deeps and shallows, and I ran those for a lot of years. And eventually, I inherited and bought and whatever other equipment from other people, and ended up with mediums and deeps and shallows. And I experimented a little with some deeps, and pretty soon I ended up with some extra shallows. And I think I ended up with about 5 different sizes of frames, and I don't know how many different sizes of boxes. And but it really causes all kinds of problems when you're trying to manage, especially the fewer hives you have, the more of a problem it creates. Because the more hives you have, the more resources you have to fall back on. But the fewer hives, the more problems you have. Let's say I got this hive, and it's doing pretty well, and I got this extra super of honey here, and I got this hive, and it's in deeps down here, but it just doesn't have any honey down there at all. I'd like to put some of this honey in those deeps to help this hive out, but it's all in shallows. So what do? Well, I could probably stick the shallows in the deeps, but it's probably going to cause me some problems later, and it would be nice if they were just all the same size. Now, if I'm running a big outfit and I've got lots of shallows sitting around, lots of deep sitting around, well, it's more likely that I can probably find a box somewhere that has what I want in it, put in there, except, again, having all these different sizes has now forced me to have to go searching for the one that's on the right size frame for the problem I've got, where if they were all the same size, I wouldn't have to search so hard, right? Just simplify my life. So, I think the frame is the basic element of a modern beehive. No matter what kind of box you put it in, you can have a bunch of different sized boxes, and still, if the frames are all interchangeable, you've got a lot of options. If the frames aren't interchangeable, you don't have as many options. So, I'd highly recommend all the same size frames. Here's a few of the advantages. You know, if you want to bait some brood up above an excluder to get them going through an excluder, it's the same size as the frames in the super, so it's no problem to take a couple of frames and put them up here and then later move them back down here. I always find this an interesting question. When I tell people I don't run an excluder, they always say, well, what do you do if the queen lays in the supers? And I say, well, if it's got, I got a stack of 8 frame medium boxes here. If this box has brood in it, it's not a super, it's a brood box. If this box has honey in it, it's a super. So she can't lay in a super, it's impossible. If she laid in it, it'd be a brood box. So I don't understand their problem. But so that's one of the advantages you get to having all the same size frames is it is whatever it is, I don't care. If I was harvesting and there was a frame of brood here, I'd just move it down and steal another frame of honey and go. I don't have to try and figure out where to put any of this stuff. There's also a typical method that I use for swarm control is I'm going to open up the brood nest. Well, if I want to open up the brood nest, often it's wall-to-wall brood that's now starting to get backfilled a little bit. I need to take a few of these and put them somewhere and put some empty frames in. Where am I going to put them? Well, if they're all the same size frames, I just put them up in the next box up. course, you're always juggling something somewhere, you know. Of course, that took some frames out of this that I'll put over in this empty box over here that's not going to go anywhere. But, you know, I can put anything anywhere. So I can juggle all this around and open up the brood nest and keep them from swarming without having to contemplate, what do I do with these 2 deep frames when all my supers are shallows? You know, I can just put anything anywhere. So I cut down all my deeps to mediums. We'll talk more about why I'm doing mediums and not deeps. I tried going to all deeps, but we're back to the gravity thing. But so I cut this. This is where I ran this through a table saw at 6 1/4 inches and just sawed off the end bar. And then I took the bottom bar and just sawed the end off the bottom bar, and then just made a butt joint here where this nails through here into here, and there's no fancy joint here. There used to be. This was a little tongue that came out, you know, and went into this little slot right here. So I just eliminated all that. I just cut them off this way, and nailed them back together. So the other issue, besides standard sizes, is lighter boxes. Jim Fisher once said, "Friends don't let friends lift deeps."
I make my wife.
What's that?
I make my wife lift them.
There we go. That's the solution. I think you're the first man who's ever said that. I've heard several women who say they make their husbands lift them. But I think that's the best plan. To me, the hardest thing physically about beekeeping is lifting boxes. The rest of it's not that bad. The rest of it might be tedious. It might be, you know, like you're harvesting and uncapping and extracting and whatever, but it's the lifting of the boxes that's the hard part. That's the part that's physically demanding. Here's a comparison of boxes. Here's a 10 frame deep that weighs about 90 pounds. And here's a 10 frame medium that weighs about 60 pounds. And here's an 8 frame medium and it weighs about 48. People are often asking me, well, could I put them in shallows? You could. The advantage to mediums over shallows is there's a lot of things available for mediums that aren't available for shallows. There's all kinds of things available from the point of view of running a brood nest, doing whatever, that are available in mediums, and most of those things aren't available in shallows. The other thing is, to me, an 8 frame medium is just about exactly what I want. It's about 48 pounds. If I pick up a bag of horse feed, it's about 50 pounds. If I pick up a box of nails, it's 50 pounds. You know, it used to be, I bought all my feed in 100-pound sacks back when I was a 20-year-old carpenter and I had chickens. I'd buy all my feed in 100-pound sacks because they were burlap. And I wanted the burlap for my smoker. All the rest of it came in paper sacks, and I didn't want the paper sacks. I wanted the burlap sacks. But I didn't really think a 100-pound sack of oats was heavy then, and they've gotten much heavier over time. So I think if you don't want to lift 100 pounds, you really ought to go with 8 frame mediums. That's my opinion. And I don't know why this isn't offered by the people who are selling bees and selling equipment as just a standard question. Why don't they ask you, you know, how much do you think you can lift before they start telling you what you ought to buy?
Question. What are you going to be using 10 years from now?
It's crossed my mind to go to shallows, but I don't know. I had already started heading down the road of horizontal hives, and I would probably go to that more if it got to be a real issue. But the problem with horizontal hives is they require a little more frequent management, and I don't do a lot of frequent management right now. So, if you're not sure what this means, if you have never lifted 50 pounds and thought about exactly what that weighs, and you haven't bought any bee equipment yet, go to the hardware store and get 2 50-pound boxes of nails and try not to hurt yourself when you try to lift them. And that's what a 10 frame deep full of honey weighs. Now, I'll have people all the time will tell me, well, the 10 frame deep is not usually full of honey. You're right, it's not usually. Usually it's got some brood in it. Usually it doesn't weigh 90 pounds, but when I go through 10 or 15 hives in an afternoon, one of them is always full of honey. So you can say usually all you want, but I guarantee you if you keep bees in deeps, they will sometimes be full of honey. That's assuming you're running deeps for the brood and shallows for the supers. Sometimes they're going to be full of honey, and when they are, anytime I end up having to lift a 10 frame deep, I hurt for a couple of weeks, and I don't want to do that anymore. So anyway, you can also take 2 50-pound bags of feed and try lifting those at the same time. That's basically what it's going to weigh. Now, That's in theory. In reality, this 90-pound box is sitting on top of another 90-pound box, and they're glued quite tightly. And you pry them apart, and you think you got it all loose, but now when you go to pick it picks up both boxes before the bottom one finally lets go. Because that 90 pounds was sitting on that glue after you pried it loose and got a good grip again. And now you try to lift it, you end up lifting 180 pounds before that thing breaks loose. So that 90 pounds glues a lot tighter than that 45 pounds when I pry it loose and it's sitting back down. It doesn't stick down nearly as tight. I usually pop it loose. So there are other issues besides just the weight of it. There's also getting glued down to the one below it. I find I can lift 50 pounds fine. To me, 50 pounds, if it weighed less than 50 pounds, I'd be tempted to pick up 2 of them. And I probably would. If it weighed more than 50 pounds, that'd probably be more than I want to lift. So how do you get from where you are to there if you want to get to just mediums? Well, I know some of these are intuitively obvious, but it's surprising how often people don't think of them. If you want to end up with mediums, don't ever buy another deep. Okay? Every chance you get, try and get rid of the deeps. You've got a friend who wants to get into beekeeping, you say, here, I'll give you more deeps. If you want to sell somebody some bees, you sell them that deep that you want to get rid of, right? And pretty soon you get rid of them all. Me, I had a lot of them though, so I cut them all down. But the first step is just stop buying what you don't want and buy what you do want. The next step is you can start converting them. I cut all the boxes down, I cut all the frames down, and I added on to the shallow boxes, but I never could figure out what to do with the frames. Shallow frames just aren't of any real value to me. But, so how do you convert to 8-frame boxes? Well, again, if you quit buying the 10-frame boxes, you can head that direction, and you can mix and match them as you're going. And you could use the 10-frame boxes for the brood for a while, and the 8-frame boxes for the supers, and it'll look, well, there's an 8-frame, there's a 10-frame. They don't look that different, do they? But they actually are. That last 2 frames is the 2 heaviest frames in the box. They really are, because the mechanical advantage of the weight that's out here is hugely more than the 2 frames that are right here. This 10 pounds out here is much heavier than this 10 pounds here. And I know that's a contradiction because the definition of weight is what it weighs, but the fact is there's a mechanical disadvantage to me as the lifter to these frames out here. If I get rid of these 2 frames here, I have not just decreased the amount of effort it takes to lift this box by the amount of that weight, I've decreased it by the amount of that weight times the mechanical advantage of that lever out there. So it's a lot lighter, not just a little lighter. This is an 8-frame medium sitting, an 8-frame medium sitting on top of 2 10-frame mediums, and this is a 20-inch long 1x3, just covering the gap. And of course, somebody always says, "Well, isn't the rain going to run down in that gap?" And well, maybe the first day, but as soon as they glue it up, it won't, and it won't take them long to glue it up. I've never seen a problem with it. I cut down all the 10-frame boxes. Now, this might require a little more skill than some of you have, but it took me a long time to think through how to do this. But basically, I cut it off at 13 3/4. You can go with 14. Those are the 2 standard sizes for 8-frame boxes. And then I cut this to fit into the frame rest right here. And then I'd recommend you screw this in with lag screws, because if you just nail it, it'll just pull out too easily. But if you screw it in with lag screws, or with deck screws, get a drill and some deck screws and screw them in there, it'll hold pretty well. You can even glue it in, screw it in with deck screws. This is a quote from Richard Taylor: "No man's back is unbreakable, and even beekeepers grow older. When full, a mere shallow super is heavy, weighing 40 pounds or more. Deep supers, when filled, are ponderous beyond practical limit." We already kind of talked about foundationless frames. I think they're a lot less work, but I'm going to skip through those because we already talked about it. No chemicals and artificial feed, to me, is a huge amount of less work. First of all, not only do I not have to go treat them, but if I don't treat them and if I don't feed them sugar syrup, then basically everything that's in the hive that's honey is honey. If I want to harvest it, I can harvest it. If I want to eat it, I can eat it. If I want to leave it, I can leave it. But I don't have to worry about, well, I fed them a whole bunch of sugar syrup. Is that in my supers? And is that going to get in my honey? And is that going to, and I fed them some terramycin. Is that going to get in my honey? I fed them some fumidil. Is that going to get in my honey? somehow there's this general philosophy out there that this magical queen excluder keeps all the chemicals below it in the brood nest. And the reality is that bees move things around anywhere they want, all the time in a colony. And in fact, all the comb honey people, if you read Honey in the Comb over there by Killian, or if you read any of C.C. Miller or Doolittle's stuff, they're counting on the bees moving all of the honey out of the brood nest up into the supers. That's what they're counting on to get this drawn really quickly. They crowd them all down to force them to move all that up in order to get some really fast drawn comb that's nice and soft and easy and melts in your mouth kind of comb honey. So bees do move things around all the time. To think that there's this section, this magical section in the hive that none of these chemicals move anywhere else is basically the equivalent of a no peeing section in the swimming pool. It's just not practical. So this, I think, is a lot less work. Basically, most falls, I'm not out there making gallons and gallons of syrup and running around all my yards trying to feed them honey. Most winters, I'm just leaving them what honey I don't take. I will try and leave them enough to get through the winter, and I'm done. I don't see how anybody can think that's not less work. They might think it'll make them less money, but I don't see how you can think it's not less work. And if that's not making you enough money, then you just need a few more hives, right? I could get more hives, not feed any of them, and still make the same amount of money and do a lot less work. So it seems to me that if the issue is that I just need to make more money, then I just need more hives. And we talked already about some of this stuff as far as what it does with the gut and causing foul brood and that study and so on. So let's go to carts. This one I bought from Brushy Mountain. It's got a hinge right here. This is a strap that holds these together. You just buckle this strap. So this hinges out. So you back up on the boxes you're trying to pick up. You have to kind of tip them a little to get this angle iron under them. And then you snap this strap across here, and then you pick it up like a wheelbarrow, and you can wheel the boxes around. Now, I had a welder add this here so I could put like 6 or 7 empty boxes, and they wouldn't all rattle off. For full boxes, this is about right. For empty boxes, it's nice to have room for more boxes. So I had a welder put this rack on it. But the rest of this came that way from Brushy Mountain. The big wheel is nice because it kind of goes over small holes better than a small wheel tends to fall on the small holes. And I'm going across a horse pasture usually where my horses have holes this big just from their hooves. So I'd like something to roll over them. It's a pretty good cart. I don't use it all that much, I admit. But part of this because I have some better ones, I think. This one I redid a bit. I'm picking up mediums, and it was really made to pick up deeps. It was made to pick up like a deep hive that's sitting on a bottom board and just roll up on it. And there's a little half moon thing on the spring here that pops into the handholds. It's shaped like the inside of the handhold. And so you slip this up on there, and you just slip it on the box. Those push back, and as they hit the handhold, they pop out. And so now you've got these metal things in the handholds. So I modified it a little bit. This piece of angle iron you can barely see here, and there's another one over here, and a hole for the axles so that the axles moved up this way, which lowers the whole thing down to the right height for a medium instead of a deep. Because it's really set up to slide under a deep, and that's another 3 inches. So I had to move this about 3 inches to make it come out right. I also added this rack here. Again, it's about right for 2 deeps. If you want to just pick up 2 deeps and move them around and they're full of bees or honey or something, it worked pretty well. But I'm often hauling 6 empty boxes out to the bee yard, and I'd like to be able to stack more of them on there. So this came from Man Lake. I was at D. Lusby shortly after I bought this and saw a very similar one that looked like a modified, it was originally just a regular dolly, but then they had redone it to have this on the front of it and redone it to have that angle like this. And it looked very much like this. And I pointed that out. I said, Dee, I've got a cart almost like that I just got from Man Lake. She said, yeah, they were down here last year taking some pictures of that. And hers looked like it was ancient. It was obviously 40 years old. This is Walter T. Kelly's, they call this a nose truck. So if you're ever trying to find it in their catalog, I have no idea why you would call this a nose truck, but that's what they call it. I suppose it's longer in the front than a typical dolly. Maybe that's the nose part. And the fact that it's a truck, I have heard people call a dolly a truck before. I don't know why. But anyway, it comes in singles and doubles. I like the doubles, especially if you're going to put like 6 or 7 full supers on here. It'll handle a little more weight. But also, if you're going across the pasture, if this one falls in the hole, this one might not fall in the same hole, and it makes it a little smoother. But that's a nice cart. Walter T. Kelly sells that one.
Maybe the upper box falls down and hits you in the nose. You stack it that high.
I don't know. A nose truck, okay. If you're having trouble lifting boxes and moving boxes around, anything that gives you a mechanical advantage is worth having. There used to be a book called Shelter. Anybody ever see the book Shelter?
It's still making it.
Is it still out? Oh, well, I've got one still on my shelf from the 70s. But anyway, there's a section in there where a guy talks about how to move heavy objects. And the number 1 rule was never lift it if you can drag it. Never drag it if you can walk it. Never walk it if you can roll it. Never move it if you don't have to. So if you can roll it, it's a lot easier moving heavy objects around. So I think you find carts useful. I see a lot of people do an awful lot of work that the bees just have to undo when you're done. I've never quite understood that philosophy, but there's this philosophy, I'm going to make the bees do what they should be doing, and the fact is the bees are doing what they should be doing. They wouldn't be doing it if they weren't supposed to be doing it. They're building burr between the boxes in this case we're talking about, and if you use any kind of plastic one-piece frames, you tend to have a really thin top bar and a really thin bottom bar, and as long as you have that, they're going to attach them between the boxes, because that's just what they do. You need at least an inch top bar to make much of a significant difference in how much they connect them. There's a lot of people who think that's because their bee space is wrong. No, it's just because anytime you have a thin top bar and a thin bottom bar, they're going to attach it between the boxes. Now to me, I don't see this as a problem. I pry up the box and it's attached to all the frames below it. And I reach in there with my bar and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I've got the box loose. And I don't know what the problem is. When I'm done, I put it back. Some people scrape all of that off now that's on the bottom of this one and it's on the top of that one, which is a whole lot of work. And when you're done, the bees are just going to rebuild it all. So I don't quite understand how that helps. I think it actually helps the queen having all that because she tends to move up and down between the boxes easier because she's got a nice ladder, but it probably isn't that big of a deal one way or the other. It does break open a lot of drone pupa typically in the brood box because they tend to put a row of drones right through there. And you can just look in there and see if you've got a lot of varroa. And it'll serve some purpose, right? Now this is a quote from Richard Taylor. Some beekeepers dismantle every hive and scrape every frame, which is pointless as the bees will soon glue it back the way it was. Here's another quote from Richard Taylor. Propolis rarely creates a problem for beekeepers. Certainly any effort to keep a hive free of it by systematic and frequent scraping is time wasted. They're going to glue it all back together. That's what they do. Actually, the only good reason to scrape propolis off is to sell the propolis because it's worth a lot of money. And for years they've been breeding bees to not make propolis. I think you're better off with bees that make a lot of propolis. Marla Spivak's recent research would show that it has a lot to do with the health of the colony, how much propolis they make. The more propolis they make, the healthier they are. So if you get bees that make lots of propolis, keep them. I have to admit it is a little frustrating at times, though. You have a hold of a frame and you're trying to let go of it, and it won't come off your gloves. But it's the price you pay. You want healthy bees, or you want to be able to let go of a frame? I don't know. I have been a fan of old books all my life, and especially old bee books, and I read a lot of them, but I don't understand the obsession all these old beekeepers had with destroying swarm cells. And somehow that has carried over to that you have a bunch of new beekeepers who have read enough books that seem to think that this will help, that as soon as they see a queen cell, they freak out and they destroy all the queen cells. Well, first of all, if you see a queen cell, I would plan on not destroying it no matter what. B, I would try and figure out why that queen cell is there and then act accordingly. Because either they're trying to swarm, or they're trying to replace a missing queen, or they're trying to supersede a failing queen. one of those three things is happening, and you really ought to try and figure out what if you want to try to help them. If you want to try to help them, you need to figure out what are they trying to do, and how can I help them do that? Because if what they're trying to do is raise a new queen to replace a failing queen, the last thing you want to do is destroy all the queen cells. If what they're doing is trying to replace the queen that you squished last week when you slammed two end bars together, the last thing you want to do is destroy all the queen cells, right? And if you open it up and there's a bunch of swarm cells, and half of them are capped, they probably swarmed day before yesterday. And you destroy all the queen cells, you're just going to leave them queenless. So you really ought to figure out what's going on in there before you do anything. And then I still wouldn't destroy any queen cells. I never destroy queen cells. I might split them if I think they're trying to swarm. I might just leave them alone if I think they're trying to supersede or if it's an emergency queen. But the last thing I'm going to do is destroy queen cells. I'm always going to leave the queen cells somewhere. I may put them in another nuke, but I'm not going to destroy the queen cells. I don't know how often I get an email, probably once a day, twice a week maybe, I don't know. I get an email with somebody asking me how to make the bees do something. And my advice is you can't make the bees do anything. You may be able to trick them into doing a few things, but even those are pretty limited. You might be able to trick them into raising a queen because you want to raise queens, and that's a pretty fun proposition actually. It's kind of an interesting thing to learn to do. If you can trick the bees into doing anything, you're doing something impressive, but you always want to be contemplating whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, because you may be helping them or you may not be helping them. If you trick them into something that they really shouldn't be doing this time of year, you may not be helping them. You know, if you trick them into raising a whole lot of brood so that they have a whole lot of mouths to feed going into winter, you may not be helping them. You always want to think it over, through the ramifications of what it is you're tricking them into doing. But you can't really make them do anything. And the sooner you get that out of your head, the better off you'll be. If you want to be a good beekeeper, you need to think in terms of what are the bees trying to do and how can I help them do it, or how can I stay out of their way so they can do it. To tell you the truth, most of the time, your best bet is to stay out of their way and let them do it. Once in a while, you'll find they're in trouble because they don't have the resources to deal with the problem. If they're getting robbed, it's probably because they don't have enough bees to guard the hive. And then you need to do something to help them out. If they don't have enough bees to guard the hive, maybe I can resolve this problem by reducing the entrance, which will reduce the need for bees to guard the hive because there's less of an entrance to guard. There's things I can do to help them, but there's not a lot I can do to make them do anything. Bees have their instincts and they do what they do, and I think your best bet as a beekeeper is to figure out what those things are, and try and help them do them. This is another good Richard Taylor quote. There are few rules of thumb that are useful guides. One is that when you are confronted with some problem in the apiary and you do not know what to do, then do nothing. Matters are seldom made worse by doing nothing and often made worse by inept intervention. The problem is we come back to that human need to do something even if it's wrong. But really, you shouldn't. If you don't know if it's going to help or not, then don't do it. I don't know how many times I've seen a posting on bee forums where somebody says, oh my gosh, I got my hive and there were some queen cells and I destroyed them all. I don't know what to do now. Maybe you should have asked that question before you destroyed all the queen cells, because now you're going to have 500 people tell you that was a dumb thing to do. And you really, if you're not sure what to do, there's only one or two situations I can think of that you need to do something right now. One of them is when the swarm is already hanging in the tree. You probably want to try and hide it because it may not be here when you get back. And the other one is if they're getting robbed. If they're being robbed, you need to put a stop to it now, immediately. Not tomorrow, now. The sooner the better. Take some screen wire and just close up the entrance to the hive, staple it all across the entrance, and stop them. And when the robbers have gone home, then you can contemplate what you want to do next. But the first thing you got to do is stop them, because they'll kill the queen, they'll kill the bees, they'll steal all their honey. You've got to stop this before it'll only get worse. It won't get better. It'll just accelerate until they've killed that colony, and the sooner you stop that, the better. Now, once you staple the screen wire over there and stop them altogether, you can go call up your beekeeping friends and you can talk it over and decide what to do next. But that's probably the only two situations I can think of where you need to do something right this minute. Almost every other situation will keep till tomorrow. You can call up some friends, you can get on a bee forum, whatever, talk it over with some people. See what you think needs to be done. We already talked about not wrapping hives, but Here's a few quotes. This is Brother Adam from Buckfast Abbey. Although we now and again have to put up with exceptionally severe winters, even here in the Southwest, I think his idea of severe winter probably isn't my idea of severe winter. He's in the UK, or he was in the UK, and I don't think it's that severe. But we do not provide our colonies with any additional protection. We know that cold, even severe cold, does not harm colonies that are in good health. Indeed, cold seems to have a decided beneficial effect on bees. When you look at the top honey-producing states in the country, it's North and South Dakota and Montana. They aren't warm places. Georgia is not the top honey producer. None of the southern states are top honey producers. You would think that they would have stuff blooming all year round and the bees would do better, but that's not how it works. Cold seems to have a beneficial effect on bees, and it seems to motivate them to really kick it into gear and put in a crop early in the year, and I'd say it does have a beneficial effect. This is a Richard Taylor quote. Nothing has been said of providing warmth to the colonies by wrapping or packing hives or otherwise, and rightly so. If not properly done, wrapping or packing can be disastrous, creating what amounts to a damp tomb for the colony. That's been kind of my experience, is wrapping just made them wet, and I don't see that that helped them any. This is probably not good advice where you live. I don't know. I've never tried it here, but my guess is it probably wouldn't work very well here. In western Nebraska, you could not paint them and they'll last every bit as long as if you paint them. It really doesn't make any difference. In eastern Nebraska, it might make a little difference if you painted them. But it's interesting. This is a quote from Richard Taylor about not painting them, and this is a quote from C.C. Miller. But C.C. Miller's in other places quotes G.M. Doolittle, and both of them say that. They were overwintering bees in a cellar, and both of them would say that the painted hives would come out all moldy, and the unpainted hives would come out looking really good in the spring, and that the painted hives actually didn't last as long as the unpainted hives. But then again, they were wintering them in the cellar, and maybe that had something to do with why one of them lasted longer than the other. But I bought a lot of equipment not so long ago and decided I was going to wax tip them instead. So I can't say I wasn't willing to risk that big of an investment on whether it was a good idea to not paint them. But this is a concept that is done in various ways by various people for various reasons. But George Emery would switch the hive bodies constantly all spring, like every 2 or 3 weeks, to prevent swarming. I don't think that's a good plan. I think it's way more work than I want to do too. But it also makes the bees do a lot of work, because you keep swapping the 2 brood chambers, then they have to keep rearranging the brood nest to try and get it back to the way they wanted it, because you keep breaking it up. You keep breaking the brood nest in half and swapping it around, and they have to rearrange it all again. About the time they get it rearranged, you rearrange it again for them. And so they're so busy trying to fix the brood nest that they never get around to swarming, which apparently seemed to work for George, although I did have a guy who knew him well once. They were sitting in his yard on his porch, and there was a swarm hanging in the tree there, and George was talking about how his bees never swarmed, and the guy points up in the tree and says, "Well, I think I see a swarm right there." And George said, "No, it's not my bees." So maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, I don't know, but George swore by it. Yeah.
Early, it seems like the bees move up, so would it be maybe not a bad idea first thing in the spring when the bees really haven't started in that bottom box to put that bottom box up?
If I happen to be in a hive and the bottom box is empty, I tend to put it on the top, not because I think it's better for the bees, but because it's easier for me to come back and check if they filled it up. I don't think they have any problem moving down and filling it up, but I can't tell when they filled it up without lifting the top box off, and I'm too lazy to lift it again. I'm already here, and I already lifted it off and found this box empty. So I usually will set the empty box off, dump all the dead bees off the bottom, put the one with the brood in it on the bottom, put that one on top, and then when I come back, I can look and see if that one's full. But bees don't just go up, they go down. Bees move into a tree, they have no choice. They start at the top and they go down. That's what they do. If you're going to say what direction bees naturally go, they go down. There's no doubt about that.
But they don't have an option in a tree.
No, they don't have the magically expanding tree that we give them where we keep putting the boxes on top. So, yeah, in a tree, they don't have any choice. They have to start at the top and go down. There is no other direction to go. So the idea that they naturally go up has never made any sense to me. I can tell you why they naturally go up. You keep putting the boxes on the top. That's where the space is. So yes, of course they'll go up. And do I put them on the top? Yeah, because I'm too lazy to lift all those boxes off to put them on the bottom. And even more so, I'm too lazy to lift them all off to get to the bottom to see if they filled that one. So if I put it on top, I can tell when they filled it. It's easy for me. I think it makes sense from a beekeeper's point of view to put them on the top because the bees really don't care. They just work wherever there's room. There's room up there, okay, we'll work up there. If there's some more room up there, okay, we'll work up there. But so they keep moving up because you keep adding boxes on the top. And I'm all for adding boxes on the top. It's too much work to put them on the bottom, and it's too much work to check them on the bottom. So, but honestly, I don't think they care. If I don't get down to that bottom box though, and I don't happen to be there, I don't bother to go through all my hives and try and swap all the boxes. It doesn't matter to me. If I happen to be there, it just makes it more convenient for me later because I can tell that that box got filled. Does that make sense? This is Richard Taylor quote again. Some beekeepers trusting the ways of bees less than I do at this point routinely switch hive bodies. That is, switch positions of the 2 stories of each hive, thinking that this will induce the queen to increase her egg laying and distribute it more widely throughout the hive. I doubt, however, such a result is accomplished. In any case, I long since found that such planning is best left to the bees. This one will save you more work than almost any other thing I can think of. Every chance you get, don't find the queen. Because every time you go looking for a queen, you've just wasted an hour. Maybe you wasted 10 minutes and maybe you wasted 2 hours. It just depends on how lucky you get. But all in all, you've wasted a huge amount of time trying to find a queen. So the question you've got to ask yourself every time you do anything you get in a hive for, is there a way I can do this without finding the queen? Now the answer may be no, and you may have to find the queen. But you'd be surprised how rare that is if you plan your management around the concept that I'm going to try to never have to find a queen. I can requeen all my hives and never find a queen. I just put queen cells in them. I put queen cells in all of them, the queens emerged, they supersede, I didn't have to find a single queen. That's if I wanted to requeen them, which I usually don't bother to do that unless I think there's a yard that's getting a little too hot on me or something's not quite the way I want it. But I don't have to go find a queen to requeen unless I go buy a queen from somebody else. Then I got to find the old queen or they'll kill the new queen. So what do? I don't ever buy a queen from somebody else anymore. I try to avoid that. Because if I avoid that, I won't have to find that queen. When I do splits, I'm running 8-frame mediums. And I'll get to that in a minute here. But I don't look for a queen when I'm doing splits. I just do walk-away splits, and the queen is wherever she is. I don't care where she is. They'll sort it out, and they'll raise a new queen in half that doesn't have a queen. So anytime you can figure out a way to do it without finding the queen, that's what I would do. There's also the issue of waiting. And this has a lot more to do with how convenient it is. If this is a hive in your backyard, and waiting might improve the odds of success, then maybe you want to make them queenless, wait overnight, and then introduce the queen tomorrow. If I'm in an outyard 60 miles away and I just found the old queen on the hive I want to requeen because let's say it's too hot of a hive and I don't want to put up with them anymore, so I find the old queen and I dispatch her, and now what am I going to do? I'm going to go eat lunch. I'm going to come back and put a queen cage in here and go home because I don't have time to mess with it. I don't want to make 3 more trips back here before I'm done trying to requeen this hive. Isaac Hopkins, who wrote about the Hopkins method of queen rearing, which is a graphless method of queen rearing, in case you're interested. But he wrote the Australasian Bee Manual over here. And in the 1886 version, he's talking about queen rearing. He's talking about how he sets up his mating nukes. And first he talks about how you should set up a mating nuke. He tells you the day before you're going to put the cells in, you should get a frame of brood and a frame of honey, make sure the queen's not on it, put it in a mating nuke, and then the next day you come back and you put the cell in. I think it's all done with the whole chapter, and he says, no, that's how you probably ought to do it. He says, that's not how I do it. He says, I just grab a frame, I look, and if I happen to see the queen, then I'll put her aside in the nuke and keep her for later. If I don't see a queen, then I put this frame and the frame of honey in this nuke box, and I put the queen cell in right now, and I put the lid on, and I move to the next one. Now, would they accept the queen cell better if I wait overnight? Probably, maybe 1 out of 100 of them would have accepted her where they didn't when I did it this way. But it's not enough to be worth another trip out here to do this. I'm going to do it and get it done and go home. I'm not going to do this and come back tomorrow and then do this and then come back tomorrow and do something else when I can just do it and go home. So that's one of the reasons I like this book, and one of the reasons I decided to republish his stuff is he's a very practical beekeeper. He'll tell you, yeah, this is probably the right way to do it, but it's just too much work. You really ought to do it. It's much easier to do it this way. And I think there's a lot of times, I've seen some guys, some of those bee scientists talk about how you ought to introduce a queen. And they'll tell you, you go out and you make them queenless and you wait overnight. And then you go back out and you put the queen in with a cork still in it and you leave that for 4 days. And then you come back and you take the cork out and you poke a hole in the candy. And you put that back in and then you come back in 4 days and see if she's been released. If she hasn't, then you actually release her. And then you come back in 2 weeks and see if she's laying. Well, if this was in an out yard, I would have dequeened them, waited 2 hours, popped the cork, put them on there, and I'll come back next year. And I'm done. And it just isn't practical. Now, if it's in your backyard and you've got nothing better to do and you feel like messing with the bees, his method's great. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. And will it improve the chances of them accepting her? Probably, but the chances of them accepting her from a candy queen cage is really pretty good to start with. So I don't know that I'm improving the odds that much. We talked a little bit about feeding dry sugar, and I'm going to show you a little more, some pictures and such here. People are always talking about making candy. In my area, they seem to like candy boards a lot. They make these lids, sometimes they call them candy lids, because basically it's a lid, and they make this candy, and they pour it in the lid, and then they put it on top. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that I'm way too lazy to make the candy, but there's nothing wrong with that. It has the advantage that when the bees tend to get to the top, they're almost always in contact with this, and it'll kind of keep them going, keep them from starving to death. That's the idea. You can't really feed them syrup when it's 20 below, but they'll eat dry sugar when it's 20 below. If they're in contact with it, they'll eat it. They won't leave the cluster to go get to it. Now, I have a top entrance, so this gap in the front here is so that the bees can still get up and go out the entrance, otherwise they'd be trapped in here, right? So I've laid a newspaper on the top of the top bars. I put a box on top of the newspaper. I poured a layer of sugar maybe this deep and sprayed it a little bit with some water to get it to clump up so it won't run through like sand, you know, if they chew through the newspaper too soon. And then I'll put another layer, maybe a little more water, another layer, and then maybe a little water on the very top, and then a little extra water on the edge here to get it where it's wet enough that they recognize it as food. And that's my feeder. I didn't buy anything. I already have the boxes. I didn't make anything. I didn't make any candy. I just poured the sugar on there. And you put as much sugar as you think they need. What's that?
This is in the form of sucrose, though.
Yes.
And based on what I read, they digest the sugars in the form of fructose and glucose better than sucrose. So that's why it's better to make it in the form of candy by heating it up to 238 to 242 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's an interesting theory, but all the research that's actually been done on inverting the sugar and then feeding to them shows that it shortens the lives of the bees when you do that. I don't know why, because it should be closer to what honey is when you do that, but it seems to shorten the lives of the bees when you do that. Usually they use either cream of tartar or tartaric acid, or they use some other mild acid.
Vinegar.
You know, vinegar could work, or ascorbic acid, or citric acid, or something, in order to facilitate the breaking down of the sugar. But all the research I've seen done on it says it actually shortens the lives of the bees when you do that. So I don't think it's that significant one way or the other from what I've seen. But all in all, I think they're just as well off with sucrose. I don't think they seem to do just fine on it either way. They seem to like invert sugar better. I don't know why. Yeah.
So is that full by the time you're finished?
Is it what?
Is that super full of sugar by the time you're finished putting it in there?
That would depend on how many bees were in the rest of the hive, what I put up there, and how heavy it is already. And I kind of try and judge what I think they need. I don't want to give them more than what they need. I don't want to give them less than what they need. So if I think there's 10 frames of bees down, 10 deep frames of bees down here, then I probably need a total of 80 pounds of feed somewhere. And if there's already 30 pounds of feed in here, then I might need 50 pounds of sugar up here. But that's a pretty extreme example. Probably more likely I put 20 pounds of sugar up here because they were just 20 pounds light. You know, they were 20 pounds lighter than I thought they should be, and so I put 20 pounds on there just so they don't starve. So,
And then would that last all winter?
I don't think I've ever fed them dry sugar that there still wasn't dry sugar left in the spring. They were usually still working on it, and that's a worst case. But I usually don't give them the dry sugar unless I think they're light in the first place. So usually I'm not even doing this. I'm just doing this when they're light. Yeah.
So talking to another local group of beekeepers that tend to subscribe to the just-in-case theories, they mention that a good side effect of this sugar layer on top can be that it absorbs quite a bit of the moisture and the condensation that comes up. Do you find that to be at all beneficial? Is that something that affects the sugar feeding?
If you think about it, as I said before, they produce probably a few gallons of water, and a few gallons of water would turn all that into syrup. So most of that moisture is probably escaping and not going into the sugar. Is some of it going into the sugar? Yes. And is that going to have an effect? It's probably going to have the same effect as putting a bunch of sawdust on the top is going to have as far as it absorbing moisture. What that effect is, I don't know. The thermodynamics of what goes on in a bee colony are so complicated. I would love to have time to study it in depth. But the reality is people tend to grab one idea and fixate on it, and I think that's how the whole thing works. For instance, what a common one I hear is that the bees don't heat the hive, they only heat the cluster, and therefore it doesn't matter if I insulate it. Well, I've lived in a lot of tents over my time. I've lived in teepees, I've lived in nylon tents, I've lived in canvas tents, I've lived in double-walled tents and single-walled tents, and I built houses in western Nebraska when it was 10 below. That was our cutoff. We'd go home if it was more than 10 below, but at 10 below we were still working, building houses. And I can tell you the complexity of what makes something warm or cold is a lot more than temperature. And I was not trying to heat the inside of any of those tents I ever lived in, but some of them were much warmer than others. Now, why were they warmer? Some of it's insulation, some of it's the reflection of the heat off of the white. A white side tends to reflect heat back at you, where a dark side tends to absorb the heat and dissipate it into the outdoors. And that double wall is way warmer than a single wall. And there's all sorts of complexities of what's going on that are not just what the temperature is and whether I'm trying to heat the tent or not. So I think it's a real mistake to oversimplify what's going on in a colony. So what's going on is extremely complicated. You got this. If you've ever had an observation hive in your living room in the middle of winter and they decide to raise some brood, you put your hand on the glass, and it is warm. It's like there's a cat in there generating 100-degree, I mean, it's warm. You put your hand on that glass, it's not room temperature, it's hot. So this cluster is radiating heat. It's not just heating itself, it's radiating heat. And that radiant heat is going out. Where is it going? Well, some of it's getting absorbed in the honey that's around them. Some of it's getting bounced off the walls and coming back at them. Some of it, so that radiant heat is going somewhere, and something's happening to it. Then we have heat that's actually, by conduction working its way through the wood and making its way to the outside. We have heat that's moving around by convection. In other words, the air is warm and the air is getting moved either by natural convection of the moist air rises and the warm air rises, and then things condense, and then that when water that's in the air condenses, it changes the temperature of the air because water, as it condenses, gives off heat. And water, as it evaporates, absorbs heat. And so you have all of that going on in the hive. And so you got this moisture, you've got the convection, you've got the conduction, you've got the radiation, you've got the reflection of the radiation, and all this stuff is going on. And it seems like I run into people all the time who think they understand that. I know I don't understand it, but I also know that I have a vague grasp of it from having lived in a teepee and not trying to heat. I'm not trying to heat the teepee, I'm trying to heat me. That's all I'm trying to heat is me. If this is a system that's basically a thermostatically controlled heater in here where they're trying to generate heat. If I leave the door open on my house, my thermostat's going to keep my house 70 degrees even though the door is wide open. But that doesn't mean it's a good idea. It's going to be 70 degrees when I close the door. So that's I think that's actually an improvement, but the temperature didn't change. So other things changed though, and I think other things change in here when you change things in this whole dynamic of what's going on in the colony. How the moisture absorbing into the sugar affects everything, I don't know. How the heat moves and gets lost and whatever, it's hard. It's a hard thing to map out. I think there's some things that are pretty clear cut and there's some things that are very not clear cut. Condensation is one of them. Condensation might be a good thing if it's happening in the right place. There's a guy who's got a whole big theory on condensation in a beehive, and that's all built around that. And he may be correct. I haven't had time to experiment with it, but the theory is that his theory is that condensation is a good thing and that it needs to be taking place, and that you need to just provide a system where it takes place in the right place. And maybe he's right, because when it condenses on the wall, it's giving off heat as it condenses, and maybe that heat is helpful to the colony. Maybe it needs to condense. Maybe some of these things need to be happening. But I don't know. I don't think about it from the point of view of it absorbing all the moisture, because I know they're producing more moisture than I can absorb. So I'm still trying to let the moisture out. Let's talk about splitting by the box. I like good strong splits. If I'm going to do splits, I like, if I was in deeps, I'd like 2 deeps full of bees and honey and whatever before I split them. Might have a couple of supers on them that are kind of empty, but I want those 2 boxes full of bees before I do a split. That's if I was on deeps. Now I'm on 8-frame mediums, so I want 4 boxes of 8-frame mediums before I'm going to do a split. Now, I have an advantage with the 8-frame mediums is that I do an awful lot of management by the box, and splitting is one of those management things I do by the box. Because my resources are more stratified because I have smaller boxes. In other words, I have smaller slices of the same resources. If I have 2 deep 10-frame boxes, this top box might be all honey, or it might have a little brood in it. And the bottom box might be all brood, or it might have a little honey in it. If I take this box and put it over here and this box over here, I haven't distributed things very evenly. With 8-frame mediums, I can pretty much do that, though. I can put a bottom board here and a bottom board here and do 1 for you, 1 for you, 1 for you, and 1 for you. And I fairly evenly distributed the resources, because the top box is probably mostly honey. The next box is probably mostly honey with a little bit of brood. The next box is probably mostly brood. And the next box is probably mostly brood. And I just gave everybody some honey and some brood. So then I can throw a couple of empty boxes on, put a lid on, and I move to the next hive. And I can walk through a yard and split the whole yard in an hour or 2. And I don't look for the queen. I don't care where she is. I don't worry about drifting. There'll be total chaos when I'm done, because every empty spot now has a hive on it. Every spot that used to have a hive on it has a different hive on it. So nobody's hive is where it used to be, because I put a bottom board and a bottom board and I divvy these 2 out. I guarantee you, not a single box is where that hive used to be. And so when they all come home, it's just chaos for a day. And the next day, everything goes back to normal. And they sort it all out. So it evens itself out pretty quickly just because of that, I think. The total confusion is to your advantage, because they don't really know where they live. They come back and they go, well, this isn't right. And maybe they go over here, maybe they go over here. Where their hive ended up may have been over there, because that's where the empty spot was, or it may have been right next door, because that's where there was an empty spot. Yes?
So what you're telling me is, if I have a top bar hive and I want to split it, I need 2 empty top bar hives, and I need to take those bars out and put them in 2 separate, different hives in different places, and have an empty hive to refill with something else?
No. You could just put your empty one here, take the first frame and put it in the new one, and the second frame you just slide it back because you're going to leave it. Take the next one and put it in this one, and then the next one slide it back and leave it, and the next one put it over here, and then the next one slide it back and leave it. Now that's kind of an easy way to not worry about what they are, because you've divvied them up every other frame. You're pretty much going to divide the resources.
Right, that makes me feel better. We don't have to build 2 hives now.
Right, there you go. But I'm really talking about doing it by the box here, not by the frame. But yeah. So that was all the equipment stuff, and that was all the management stuff. So questions? All kinds of questions. Somebody want to take somebody a microphone? He's going to get a microphone. Yeah.
Since you're talking about lazy beekeeping, can you speak to Oscar Barone's automatic hive, which is set it and come back and harvest once a year?
I left mine for 3 years, so I think I got him beat, but I think you'll get a lot, how do I say that? It's not a question of how often you manage them, it's more a question of how well you manage them, but managing them well may require more times than twice a year. Oscar is in beekeeping paradise. He's in South America, right? I mean,
Argentina, yeah.
he's in Argentina. This isn't Argentina. They might do a lot better there with that management method than here. He's basically doing a warray, except in a bigger box. He's kind of trying to leave them alone, and it's basically just wild home that you couldn't manage them if you wanted to. And I hesitate to get into that discussion because most states have laws against hives that have unmanageable comb, and I have nothing against unmanageable comb if you're willing to take responsibility and take care of them. But that's illegal in most states to have comb that's not movable comb. And it's probably just not worth even considering. You guys don't know that? Well, let me explain. Most states back in the probably back in the 20s or 30s, maybe even before that, most states passed a law against having hives that didn't have movable combs, because they wanted bee inspectors who could go check to see if there was any brood diseases, so that they could make sure that they were getting taken care of, so that they wouldn't spread. And AFB was the main concern, and so almost every state passed a law against hives that didn't have movable comb. They have to have movable comb so that the inspectors can inspect them. And if the inspectors can't inspect them, they can burn them. And that they used to do that. I haven't heard of that happening in recent times, as far as just because it wasn't movable. But they won't appreciate it, and they may give you a very hard time and force you to do a cutout and put it in a real hive if they're being generous. And if they're not being generous, they'll just burn your hive. But, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the medium frames too, and I'm really having a hard time finding a good source of foundation. I mean, most catalogs, you got the small and the large, but as far as I want to use foundations for medium frames, I'm finding very little of it, or plastic only. Any recommendations?
I usually see the opposite. There's usually lots of stuff available in medium that isn't available in shallow. And there's a lot of stuff that isn't available in shallow. I don't know of anything that isn't available in medium. What are you trying to find that you're not finding in medium?
I was just going to change the size of my frames and cut my frames down and go to medium boxes, and I just, Man Lake and stuff, I'm just not finding a good source of medium foundation.
What kind of foundation do you want?
Wax. I mean,
just standard size wax, wired, vertical?
Yes. Anything. Just not finding it.
Well, Walter T. Kelly's a good bet for wax, and so is Date. Man Lake is a little more focused on the commercial stuff, and they tend to focus more on the plastic, I think. You'll probably have a lot better luck with Walter T. Kelly or Date.
Okay.
But personally, I want small cell, and it's available in mediums or deeps, wired or not wired, whatever. From Brushy Mountain, from Date, from Walter T. Kelly, I think you get all of those. Plus, I think all of those Walter T. Kelly has always had probably the widest variety of sizes and shapes and configurations of foundation. You could get 7-Eleven from them when nobody else had it. Probably nobody else has it now. 7-Eleven is a size halfway between a drone and a worker that you can put in and they usually make it thin surplus so you can do it for comb honey, and the queen doesn't want to move up in there and lay because it's not the right size for her to lay in. It's too big for a worker and too small for a drone. And so she just looks at it and goes, no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. And then eventually she wanders off somewhere else.
Is that how you get away without a queen excluder?
It's one of the things I have done in the past. I haven't done it in a long time. I'm mostly foundationless now, and if the queen lays in there, I just leave that frame there and harvest the other ones. I don't. But I have done that in the past, yes. And it works well the first year. It doesn't necessarily work if you do it for cut comb and you harvest it, and and then you put in new foundation next year, it works pretty well. If you leave it over until the next year, sometimes they'll start reworking it into drone, and then it doesn't work so well for what it was intended, which was to try and keep the queen from laying in it.
Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
With the top entrance.
Wait a
I
minute.
think he's got a.
Can I use the mic? You got it here?
When you have a top entrance, do you have a buildup of debris on the bottom that's a problem?
Not any more than you have with the bottom entrance. I mean, over winter, it tends to accumulate. In the spring, they tend to get more bees available to do the work, and they tend to start cleaning it off. And if I happen to get to the bottom, I dump it off, just like I did when I had bottom entrances. And if I don't make it to the bottom, I don't worry about it, and they tend to clean it up. I don't think it makes any difference. Watching them in my observation hive in my living room, I've seen a house bee dragging a dead bee around, and it goes over here and up here and over here and down here and over here and down here. And the entrance is at the bottom, but they're still wandering around in there with this dead bee, and eventually they finally find the bottom and finally take it out. So I think it makes any difference. No, I don't think it. I think how quickly they find the entrance would help them more than where it is. So I'm not, and I think up top with some sunlight coming might actually help that bee find the entrance. So yeah, I don't think it really makes any difference. Debris will accumulate when they're short on workers to keep it clean, like at the end of winter and coming into spring when they're really just starting the spring buildup. But once you start getting a good population of bees, then they start cleaning it up. I don't see any difference between the bottom entrance and the top entrance on that. But yes, trash accumulates in both conditions, and trash eventually gets cleaned up in both situations. Questions? Shall we take another break? And what do you guys want to do when we get back?
Oh, here's a question.
One quick question.
Sure.
I understand the condensation, but I'm a little confused about heat when it rises and you have a, why doesn't it just go out the top
It does.
in the winter?
It does.
And it doesn't matter?
I can make the argument people always make that they're not trying to heat the hive, but I think that's kind of a two-edged statement. But I have more problems with bees dying because they got water dripped on them than I do because they got cold. The water is a bigger issue. They have to, if it drips on them, then they have to evaporate all that water back off of them, and that seems to be what kills them more often than the cold. So if I lose some of the heat, getting rid of the moisture, I think I still come out ahead on the deal. But that's, some of this would be interesting to get a lot of probes that would measure a lot of things, like not just the temperature in different parts of the hive, but what's the humidity in different parts of the hive and how much condensation is taking place where. And then if you can map out what's happening in a hive currently, then you might be able to start thinking in terms of what could I do to improve the outcome and try and measure whether you did improve it, because I don't know. When it comes to ventilation, I think it's one of the more complicated beekeeping questions, not only in the winter, but in the summer. In the summer, they're trying to cool the hive. So there's a tendency, and I've made the same decision at times, but I'm questioning that decision now. There's a tendency to think, well, if they're bearding on the outside, then it's too hot, and I need to create more ventilation so they move inside. But how do I know I just didn't create more work for them and they all had to move inside to take care of the work that I just created? The fact is they have to cool the hive, and if I create too much ventilation, they can't cool the hive. And so I don't know for a fact that I'm helping them just because I got them all to go back in the hive. I don't know. But when Huber did research on ventilation on hives, he was mostly looking at skeps. So he built a bell jar, that looked about like a skep, and he put an entrance in it, and he created a fan that would do basically what the bees were doing, just blowing some air in, and put candles in there and see how long they'd burn, and he was trying to measure whether he had more or less ventilation. Well, when he added more holes, he actually got less ventilation, and the candle would go out sooner. So his conclusion was that multiple holes were not conducive to better ventilation. They actually interfered with the ventilation. Well, that's an interesting concept. I don't think we really I don't know of anybody who's explained it well enough that I think I understand how best to manage ventilation in the summer, other than I'll say this: I don't think extremes are what you want. You want a happy medium in the middle somewhere. You want them to be able to ventilate well enough to cool it off, because obviously no ventilation, they'll die. But But it's also obvious that too much ventilation and they can't keep it cool. If it's 104 outside and they're trying to keep the brood nest 93, they have to cool it. And they can't cool it if too much air is coming in. So there's got to be some happy medium there, and they seem to do just fine in a tree with a hole about this big. That's all I really know, is that they did pretty well with a hole about this big in a tree. Other than that, it's hard to say what is better and what's worse. I've seen trees where there's more than one hole. I've seen trees where there was a hole up in a limb here. And if you've ever done trap outs, you start discovering how many other holes there were in a tree because they keep getting back in when you're trying to trap them out. But yeah, I don't know if I know the answer to what is ideal for ventilation, but I would say you always want to err on being in the middle of the road, not on some extreme or another, because I don't think the extremes are the right path. Where is that exact perfect place in the middle? I don't know. But I think that's what you're looking for, is that place in the middle. That makes sense?
If you want to understand why the too many holes didn't work, then go on the fire service page and read about ventilating smoke and heat from a fire. It becomes very clear about the optimum size at each end, as it were.
Okay, what do you want to talk about after we get back from a break here? Okay, I'll do some I haven't done checkerboarding. I've kind of tried to play with it, but they're always on the top where I am, and I don't know how to manage that thing on the top. We can talk about splits and swarms. We can talk about... I don't really have a presentation on just that, but I'd be happy to talk about it. I've got one on fallacies. I've got one on small cell hive management. I've got one on Huber's new observations on bees. I've got one on natural cell size. Okay, what do I have for swarm preventions and splits? Who wants to hear that? Who wants to hear about the wintering newts?
I like that too.
You can go for both, I don't care. Okay, shall we do swarm prevention and splits then? Okay, well, let's take a 2-minute break and we'll do swarm prevention and splits.